The morning sun filtered through the grand windows of Clarence's house as George sat at his mahogany desk, reviewing correspondence from various charities. At 28, he had grown into his royal duties with a grace that made his grandmother proud, though the weight of expectation sometimes pressed heavily on his shoulders. His dark hair caught the light as he leaned forward, focused on a letter from a children's hospital in Manchester. The sound of hurried footsteps echoed through the marble hallway outside his study. George looked up just as appeared in the doorway, her usually composed demeanor replaced by something that made his stomach clench with immediate worry. Her face was pale, and her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the doorframe. "George, darling," she began, her voice catching in a way that sent alarm bells ringing in his head. "I need to speak with you about your mother." He stood immediately, the letter forgotten as it fluttered to the floor. Diana had been visiting a rehabilitation center in Scotland, working with young people struggling with addiction. It was the kind of cause that had always been close to her heart, and she had been excited about the program they were implementing there. "What's happened?" George asked, moving around the desk toward. "Is she all right?" His eyes filled with tears, and she seemed to struggle with her words. "There's been an accident, George. A terrible accident on the motorway near Edinburgh." The world seemed to tilt sideways for a moment. George felt his legs weaken, and he reached out to steady himself against the desk. "What kind of accident? How bad is it?" "The police called about an hour ago," continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Her car, it went off the road during a rainstorm. The weather conditions were terrible up there last night." George's mind raced, trying to process the information. His mother was careful, always wore her, always had the best drivers. How could this have happened? "Is she injured? Which hospital is she at? I need to go to her immediately." Stepped closer, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "George, sweetheart, I'm so sorry. The impact was... It was too severe. The paramedics did everything they could, but..." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. George stared waiting for her to take them back, to tell him this was some horrible mistake. But the tears streaming down her face told him everything he needed to know. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "No, that can't be right. She was supposed to call me last night after the evening session. When she didn't, I just thought she was tired." "The police said it happened around midnight," explained, her own voice breaking. "The road was completely flooded. They think she might have hit a patch of standing water and lost control." George sank into the chair behind him, his entire body going numb. Diana, his vibrant, caring, unstoppable mother, was gone. The woman who had taught him that being royal meant serving others, who had held him when nightmares woke him as a child, who had been his anchor in a world full of protocol and expectation. "I should have insisted on going with her," he said, his voice hollow. "She always takes on too much, travels too far for these causes. I should have made her take a larger security detail." Knelt beside his chair, her hand on his knee. "This isn't your fault, George. Your mother was doing what she loved, helping people who needed her. She wouldn't want you to blame yourself." The next few hours passed in a blur of phone calls and arrangements. George found himself moving through the motions mechanically, his grief too large and raw to fully comprehend. William and Harry had to be told, though they were both abroad on official duties. The Queen needed to be informed. The Prime Minister's office required notification. The machinery of royal protocol began turning immediately, even in the face of such devastating personal loss. As the afternoon wore on, George sat in his study, staring out at the gardens where he and his mother had walked just a week before. She had been excited about a new initiative to bring art therapy to hospital patients, describing her vision with the passion that had always defined her approach to charitable work. She never got to see it implemented, he murmured to himself, fresh tears sliding down his cheeks. Kate arrived in the late afternoon, having canceled all her engagements the moment she heard the news. She found George exactly where had left him hours earlier, still in the same chair, still staring out at nothing. "Oh, George," she whispered, rushing to his side. He looked up at her with eyes so full of pain that it took her breath away. Without a word, she wrapped her arms around him, and finally, the dam broke. George wept against her shoulder with the raw, devastating grief of a son who had lost his mother far too soon. "I keep thinking she's going to call," he sobbed. "That this is all some terrible mix-up, and she's going to ring wondering why I haven't returned her messages." Kate held him, her own tears falling into his hair. She had loved Diana too, had looked forward to having her as a mother-in-law when she and George married. Diana had been nothing but welcoming and warm, treating Kate like a daughter from the moment George had introduced them. As evening fell over London, the palace released a brief statement confirming the tragic news. Within hours, flowers began appearing outside Kensington Palace, left by mourners who remembered Diana's compassion and dedication to charitable causes. The same outpouring of public grief that had marked her earlier troubles now marked her passing. George stood at the window of his study as darkness settled over the city, watching the steady stream of people laying flowers and lighting candles. His mother had always said that the love of the people was what made their service worthwhile. Now that love was being expressed in their grief, and somehow that brought him a small measure of comfort. "She would be so moved by this," Kate said softly, standing beside him. "She always said that kindness was the most important thing," George replied, his voice still rough from crying. "That everything else was just window dressing, but kindness was what actually mattered." The phone rang constantly throughout the evening, world leaders expressing condolences, family members offering support, charity organizations remembering Diana's contributions. Each conversation was a reminder of how many lives she had touched, how much good she had done in her 45 years. As the night grew late, George finally allowed himself to eat something, though food seemed tasteless and unnecessary. Kate stayed beside him, offering quiet support without trying to fill the silence with empty platitudes. Checked on them periodically, her own grief evident but controlled. "The funeral arrangements will need to be discussed tomorrow," mentioned gently as she brought them tea. "But tonight, just rest, let yourself grieve." George nodded, though he doubted sleep would come. How could he rest when his mother's voice would never again fill these halls, when her laughter would never echo through family gatherings, when her advice would never again guide him through difficult decisions? The weight of what lay ahead pressed down on him. Diana's charities would need leadership. Her patronages would need to be redistributed. The causes she championed would need new voices to carry them forward. It all seemed impossibly overwhelming in the face of such raw loss. But as midnight approached and Kate dozed beside him on the sofa in his study, George made a quiet promise to his mother's memory. He would carry forward her legacy of compassion. He would ensure that her work continued, that the people she had helped would not be forgotten, that her dedication to making the world a kinder place would live on through him and his future service. Outside, the candles flickered in the London night, tiny flames of love and remembrance that would burn until dawn, just as his mother's influence would burn bright in his heart for the rest of his life. 3 weeks after Diana's funeral, George stood in the drawing room of Clarence House, surrounded by boxes of his mother's personal effects that had been returned from her final trip. Each item felt like a small knife to his heart, her reading glasses folded neatly in their case, the leather journal where she recorded her thoughts about the charity work, her favorite silk scarf that still carried the faint scent of her perfume. Kate sat on the Persian carpet nearby, carefully sorting through photographs and letters. The official mourning period was drawing to a close, but George's grief felt as fresh as the day had delivered the devastating news. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by dreams where his mother was still alive, making the daily awakening to reality a fresh torture. "Look at this," Kate said softly, holding up a photograph of Diana with a group of young people at the rehabilitation center. Her smile was radiant, her arms around 2 teenagers who beamed back at the camera. "She looks so happy here, so alive." George took the photo with trembling fingers. It had been taken just days before the accident, possibly on her last day of life. The irony wasn't lost on him that she had died returning from work that brought her such joy. "I still can't understand how it happened," he murmured, studying his mother's face in the photograph. "She was such a careful driver, and the security team said the roads weren't that bad when they checked the route earlier that day." A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Charles entered, his face grave in a way that immediately put George on alert. His father had been a steady source of support during these difficult weeks, but something in his expression now suggested this wasn't a casual visit. "George, I need to speak with you privately," Charles said, glancing meaningfully at Kate. Kate began to rise, but George caught her hand. "Whatever you need to say, she can hear it. Kate's going to be my wife. She has a right to know anything that affects our family." Charles hesitated for a moment, then closed the door behind him and moved to the window overlooking the garden. His shoulders were tense, and he seemed to be struggling with how to begin. "There's been a development regarding your mother's accident," he finally said, turning back to face them. "The police investigation has uncovered some irregularities." George's blood ran cold. "What kind of irregularities?" "The forensics team found evidence that suggests Diana's car didn't hit standing water," Charles explained, his voice carefully controlled. "The damage patterns are inconsistent with losing control due to road conditions." Kate's grip on George's hand tightened. "What are you saying?" "They believe someone may have forced her off the road," Charles continued. "There are paint traces on her bumper that don't match her vehicle, and tire marks suggest another car was involved." The room seemed to spin around George. "You're telling me my mother was murdered?" "We don't know for certain," Charles said quickly. "But the investigation has been reclassified. They're treating it as suspicious circumstances rather than an accident." George stood abruptly, packing to the fireplace where his mother's portrait hung. Her painted eyes seemed to follow him, and he felt a surge of rage so intense it left him breathless. "Who would want to hurt her?" he demanded. "She spent her life helping people, her charity work, her advocacy for the disadvantaged. Who could possibly see that as a threat?" Charles was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his words sent another chill through the room. "The police want to interview again. Apparently there are some discrepancies in her statement about when she received the call about the accident." George spun around. "What kind of discrepancies?" "She told you the police called her about an hour before she spoke with you," Charles explained reluctantly. "But the phone records show the police called the palace switchboard at 7:30 in the morning, didn't speak to you until nearly 10 a.m. The implications hung in the air like poison gas. Kate was the first to voice what they were all thinking. "Why would she wait 2.5 hours to tell you?" George felt the ground shifting beneath his feet again, just as it had the morning delivered the news. But this time, the disorientation came not from grief, but from the growing suspicion that everything he thought he knew about his mother's death might be a lie. "There has to be an explanation," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe she was trying to verify the information before she told me. Maybe she wanted to spare me until she was certain." Charles nodded, though he looked far from convinced. "That's what I hope we'll discover. But George, you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that things may not be as they first appeared." The next few days passed in a haze of official meetings and private agonizing. George found himself studying every interaction he'd had with since his mother's death, looking for signs he might have missed. She had been supportive, certainly, but now he wondered if her consolation had carried an undertone of something else. Guilt, perhaps, or calculated manipulation. When the police arrived to re-interview, George insisted on being present. She sat in the formal sitting room of Clarence House, her hands folded in her lap, her usual composure intact despite the circumstances. "Lady," Detective Inspector Sarah began, "we need to clarify some details about the morning you informed Prince George about his mother's accident." "Of course," replied smoothly. "Though I'm not sure what more I can tell you. It was the most horrible morning of my life, having to deliver such devastating news. According to our records, the palace switchboard received notification of Princess Diana's death at 7:32 a.m., continued. You spoke with Prince George at approximately 9:45 a.m. Can you explain the delay?" For just a moment, something flickered across face. It was so brief that George almost missed it, but it looked like fear. "I wanted to verify the information," said carefully. "The news was so shocking, so terrible, that I felt I needed to confirm it before traumatizing George unnecessarily." "Who did you contact for verification?" asked. I called the hospital directly, and the local police station. I wanted to be absolutely certain before delivering such devastating news." "Made a note. We'll need the names and numbers of who you spoke with for our records." "Of course," agreed, though George noticed her hands had begun to tremble slightly. As the interview continued, George found himself studying with new eyes. The woman who had been like a second mother to him, who had comforted him through his darkest moments of grief, suddenly seemed like a stranger. Every gesture, every expression felt calculated now, as if he were seeing her true face for the first time. After the police left, attempted to speak with George privately, but he found he couldn't bear to be alone with her. The trust that had been the foundation of their relationship had cracked, and he wasn't sure it could ever be repaired. "George, surely you don't suspect me of anything sinister," she said as he walked her to her car. "I loved Diana. We had our differences in the past, but I would never wish her harm." He looked into her eyes, searching for the truth. "Then why do I feel like you're lying to me?" "Because you're grieving," she replied, reaching out to touch his arm. "Grief makes us suspicious of everyone, makes us look for someone to blame. But I'm not your enemy, George. I'm trying to protect you." "Protect me from what?" But was already getting into her car, leaving his question hanging in the cool London air. That night, George lay awake staring at the ceiling, his mind churning with possibilities he didn't want to consider. If his mother's death wasn't an accident, if someone had deliberately harmed her, then who? And why? And most disturbing of all, what role, if any, had played in the tragedy that had shattered his world? Kate curled against his side, her breathing deep and even, but George couldn't find peace. Somewhere in the darkness, the truth was waiting to be discovered. And he was beginning to fear that, when it finally emerged, it would destroy everything he thought he knew about the people he loved and trusted most. The investigation was just beginning, but already George could feel his world shifting again, foundations cracking beneath the weight of unanswered questions. His mother's death had taken her from him forever, but now he faced the possibility that her death might take even more than that. It might take his faith in the people he had always counted on to tell him the truth. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Kate had been going through Diana's personal phone, hopping to find something that might bring George comfort, when she discovered a series of text messages that made her blood run cold. "George," she called urgently from his study, where Diana's belongings were still spread across every surface. "You need to see this." He found Kate staring at the phone screen, her face pale with shock. "What is it?" "Look at these messages," she said, handing him the device. "They're from the night your mother died." George's hands shook as he read the text thread. The messages began at 11:47 p.m., just 13 minutes before the estimated time of the accident. "Diana, we need to talk. It's about George and your interference with our wedding plans." "Diana, whatever you want to discuss can wait until I return to London." "No, it can't wait. I'm tired of you undermining Charles and me at every turn. Meet me at the near. We're going to settle this once and for all." "Diana, absolutely not. I'm going to bed. We'll speak next week." "If you don't come, I'll tell George about your affair with James Harrison. The press will have a field day." The messages stopped there, but the implication was devastating. George sank into the nearest chair, his entire world tilting on its axis yet again. "She blackmailed her," he whispered. "Blackmailed my mother into meeting her on that road." Kate knelt beside him, her own shock evident. "We have to give this to the police immediately." "James Harrison," George said, his mind struggling to process this new information. "That's the director of the Children's Hospital in Manchester. They work together on several projects." The affair allegation might have been true, or it might have been a fabrication designed to manipulate Diana. But it didn't matter now. What mattered was that had used it as leverage to force a meeting that ended in tragedy. Within hours, Detective Inspector was back at Clarence House, examining Diana's phone with the forensics team. The text messages provided the missing piece of the puzzle that transformed a suspicious accident into a homicide investigation. "We'll need to bring Lady in for questioning immediately," explained to George and Charles. "These messages establish both motive and opportunity." Charles looked as though he had aged 10 years in the span of an hour. The woman he loved, the woman he had married despite decades of public controversy, was now the prime suspect in his first wife's murder. "I can't believe this," he murmured, packing the length of the study. "Has her faults, but she's not a killer. There has to be another explanation." "The evidence suggests otherwise," replied grimly. "We've also found CCTV footage from a service station showing Lady's car on the M74 at 11:30 p.m. that night. She was supposed to be in London." George felt numb as the full scope of deception became clear. She had driven to Scotland, forced his mother into a meeting, somehow caused the accident that killed her, and then spent weeks comforting him through his grief while knowing she was responsible for it. "She held me while I cried," he said, his voice hollow. "She brought me tea and told me it wasn't my fault, all while knowing she had murdered my mother." The arrest happened 2 days later. George watched from an upstairs window as police cars surrounded Clarence's house and was led away in handcuffs. She maintained her innocence, insisting the meeting had been a misunderstanding, that Diana's death had still been an accident. But the forensic evidence told a different story. Paint traces on Diana's car matched vehicle. Tire marks at the scene showed that someone had deliberately forced Diana's car off the road and into the stone barrier that caused the fatal impact. In the weeks that followed, the full story emerged through the investigation and its eventual confession. She had been consumed with jealousy over Diana's continued influence in Charles's life and her boys' lives. The final straw had come when Diana expressed concerns about George's relationship with Kate, suggesting he was too young to marry and should wait. Had seen this as Diana's final attempt to control their lives from beyond their marriage. In a rage, she had driven to Scotland and confronted Diana on that dark, rainy night. When Diana refused to back down, when she threatened to tell Charles about his increasingly erratic behavior, had snapped. "I never meant for her to die," she sobbed during her confession. "I just wanted to scare her to make her understand that she couldn't keep interfering. But she tried to drive away and I followed her, and I was so angry I just wanted her to stop, to listen to me." The collision had been intentional, but claimed she hadn't intended for it to be fatal. The distinction meant little to George, who had to grapple with the reality that the woman he had trusted to comfort him through his grief was the very person who had caused it. Kate had been the one to save him in those dark days after the truth emerged. While Charles struggled with his own guilt and disbelief, while the media descended on the royal family like vultures, Kate remained steady and strong beside George. "I keep thinking about those seconds," George told her one evening as they walked through Kensington Gardens. "If you had found those messages just a few minutes earlier that night, if the police had investigated more thoroughly from the beginning, if I had insisted on going to Scotland with her." "You can't torture yourself with what-ifs," Kate replied, taking his hand. "Your mother is gone, and that's a tragedy nothing can change. But now we know the truth and will pay for what she did." The trial was a media sensation that George tried desperately to avoid. His defense team argued that she had been mentally unstable, consumed by years of public criticism and private insecurity. They painted her as a victim of circumstances rather than a calculated killer. But George knew better. In the days following his mother's death, when he had been most vulnerable, had manipulated his grief for her own benefit. She had positioned herself as his protector and comforter while knowing she was the source of his pain. The jury ultimately found her guilty of manslaughter rather than murder, accepting that the killing hadn't been premeditated even though the confrontation had been. She received a sentence of 15 years in prison. Charles retired from public life immediately after the verdict, unable to bear the scrutiny and his own complicity in the events that had led to Diana's death. He had chosen over Diana, had married her despite the public's reservations, and had trusted her with his family's welfare. "I should have seen the signs," he told George after the sentencing. "The jealousy, the possessiveness, the way she spoke about Diana when she thought no one was listening. I chose to ignore it because I loved her." George found that he could forgive his father more easily than he could forgive. Love made people blind to faults, made them excuse behavior they shouldn't. But crime had been cold and calculating, disguised by years of seeming devotion. As autumn settled over London, George stood once again in his study, but this time the boxes of his mother's belongings had been carefully stored away. Kate was planning their spring wedding, a celebration Diana would never see, but one George was determined to fill with the joy and love his mother had always championed. The trauma of the past months had changed him irrevocably. The naive trust he had once placed in people was gone, replaced by a more cautious understanding of human nature. But it had also strengthened his resolve to honor his mother's legacy in his own life and work. "She would want us to be happy," Kate said, joining him at the window where they could see visitors still leaving flowers at the memorial garden created in Diana's honor. "She wouldn't want her death to define our lives." George nodded, wrapping his arm around the woman who had stood by him through the worst period of his life. Kate had been his anchor when everything else fell apart, his source of strength when he thought he might break under the weight of betrayal and grief. "Sometimes I wonder if she somehow knew," he said quietly. "If she sensed that was dangerous and was trying to protect us in her own way." "Maybe she was," Kate replied, "but now it's up to us to protect each other." In the distance, Big Ben chimed the hour, marking another moment in a life forever changed by secrets and lies. George had learned that love and loyalty could be weapons in the wrong hands, that trust was a precious thing that could never be fully restored once broken. But he had also learned that true love endured, that real relationships could weather even the worst storms. As he and Kate planned their future together, George carried his mother's memory forward not as a burden of grief, but as a reminder of the importance of kindness, honesty, and protecting the people who mattered most. The truth had come too late to save Diana, but it had come in time to save George from a lifetime of loving the wrong people for the wrong reasons. In that distinction lay the possibility of healing and the hope that his mother's death might yet serve a purpose in teaching him how to live.